which the general welfare is looked after as opposed to special interests. And we have to do it. We're stuck if we stay the way we are, and we're messed up if we change. So how are we going to do that?
Well, you know, one of the things that the euro and maybe the global financial crisis brought out is our systems have gotten very complex so that it is very hard to understand. And that complexity has given a field day for some people who have some special interest to try to do things behind, you might say, closed doors, and even after they're open, it's hard to understand. Just to, you know, I don't want to digress onto a trade agreement, but TPP, 6,000 pages long. How many people do you think have read TPP, including the president? But we know, looking at inside it, that there are some things that are really, really bad that have been put there by corporate interests. So that is a part of the complexity of modern life. And one of the reasons I've been writing some of these books is that, by an attempt to, you might say, demystify some of the aspects of these issues, and the euro is being one, where I think the people there who put it together really had the best of intentions. They really thought they were going to create, they're visionaries, and they were going to create a system that would be peace in our, and prosperity, and it was a move forward, and the economic complexity took hold.
Following what you say, do you think that it will be better to have 2 euros, one for the north, one for the south?
Yes, I think it would be certainly better to have at least 2 or 3 than the single currency. Probably would not be ideal to have 19 different currencies, and that's one of the points that I'm making in the book. But it is interesting, worth pointing out that even very small countries can have their own currency and manage it. Iceland, 350,000 people, has their own currency, and because they had their own currency, even though they had one of the deepest downturns in the global financial crisis, their banks misbehaved even worse than ours, and yet they had one of the fastest bounce backs, and it was partly because of the flexibility of their exchange rate.
If you consider the U.S. monetary policy as the alternative to the European monetary policy, we've gone through several rounds of monetary expansion, right? And what it's led to is enormous wealth for those that own assets and those that are in the investment class. But that prosperity is not seemed to reach like people in rural communities, and I would compare them to their like our Greece, like middle Tennessee or rural West Virginia. And it's difficult for me, I mean, if you say that this is a preferable policy, but I'm just saying it's difficult for me to see how that prosperity will ever reach them.
Now, let me say, having a central bank that focuses on not just inflation, but employment, growth, and stability, financial stability, is not guaranteeing that things are going to work, but it's better than just focusing on inflation. Now, I agree with you. Monetary policy has reached the limits of its ability, and we need fiscal policy. So no matter what would have been the rules, monetary policy probably would not have been adequate. But the contrast with Europe should be very clear. In 2011, Europe was going down. Global financial crisis, that was not recovering from the global financial crisis. 2010 was the beginning of the euro crisis, the beginning of the Greek crisis. 2011, Trichet, who was the head of the ECB at the time, raised interest rates twice. Why? Because he said, my job is not worrying about unemployment. So what if it's 12, 15%? That's somebody else's problem. But whose it wasn't clear. But his job was to fight inflation. He saw the inkling of inflation. There wasn't any inflation, but he saw the inkling of inflation. His job was single-minded, focus on inflation. He raised interest rates twice. So it was a bad judgment call, but you can say, given his mandate, he was just doing what he was instructed to do. Be careful about inflation. Now, the more general point you raised, I couldn't agree more. Our policies of QE without fiscal policy have not only not restored our economy to full employment, have actually led to a lot of inequality. Not just the inequality that you talked about, enormous wealth inequality. Who owns the equities who've gone up as a result of the low interest rates? Disproportionately, people at the top. Who are the people who are suffering from low interest rates, the retirees who bought T-bills? So the policy, as well-intentioned as it was, has been a major source of increase in wealth inequality.
We've got time just for a couple more questions.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. It seems to me that the situation, particularly in Greece, is really very difficult, but that there are both things to avoid and there are options that are interesting. The basis, looking at what's happened in the CFA zone, in West and Central Africa, a continuation of a fixed currency regime for countries which don't have the appropriate institutions is just not an option.
Yeah.
It's credible, one. Two, a couple of countries quit the CFA zone, Madagascar and Guinea. Theirs is not an example to follow. So it seems to me that we have to come back to the lessons actually of the original approach to structural reform of the early 80s, which was to combine appropriate fiscal adjustment, but together with actual deep reforms that tackled relevant problems.
Well, let me say, I agree with the first part, but not with the second part. For those of you who don't know, that West Africa shares a common currency, and it was at one pegged to the euro. So if you think that there's a lot of diversity within Europe, you can imagine pegging Africa, these poor countries, with that was a big mistake. And among them, many economists think that was one of the reasons that many of the countries in West Africa have done so poorly. So to me, the ending of the exit from it is a necessary. But again, it's not sufficient. There are many ways you can have bad economic policy. And ingenuity in this area is unlimited. But the structural, was called structural adjustment of the 1980s that was imposed on Africa was an utter disaster. It was a quarter century of stagnation. After a quarter century, GDP was the same roughly as it was before. And today, the level of industrialization in Africa is lower than it was 30 years ago. So that, to me, was the result of that structural adjustment policy. So in terms of I'm very hostile to that kind of the structural adjustment policy that was imposed on those countries. But we won't be able to discuss that here. Let me just say.
A quick comeback.
No, I think he has to.
We really don't have time. We have time for one more question.
Just this morning, Mario Draghi said March 7th, 2017 and beyond, possibly, for continuing asset purchases. The Italian banks, I mean, they're in like really bad shape. I mean, you said that Italy's not quite in crisis, but the banks are. Can you talk about that, or just?
Well, as I mentioned, Italy is one of the subjects of concern right now all over the world, and the reason is that some of the banks are in a precarious position, and the problems in Italy illustrate some aspects of European diversity. One of the general rules that many people supported after the 2008 crisis was that when a bank runs into trouble, before the taxpayer comes to bail it out, the shareholders ought to bear the cost and the bondholders. And that was the big lesson of Citibank. Why did we bail it out? It was really, you could save the bank without saving the shareholders, the bondholders, and the bankers. That became, and the European Union has adopted that basically as a principle. But then comes along Italy, where the bondholders are different than in most other countries, because the Italian banks sold to ordinary citizens bonds as if they were certificates of deposit. So if you wipe out the bondholders, you're wiping out a large number of ordinary Italians who thought they were just like ordinary deposits. And they weren't explained. These are not insured, So you have to have, so they're struggling. How do we have a system of rules that works across Europe, given the diversity within Europe? And so right now the European Commission says you can't come to their aid. So Renzi says, I'm going to have to figure this out, because if I don't figure this out, I may lose the election. And the Five-Star Movement, which wants to get out of the Europe totally, or out of the euro totally, is going to be in the ascendancy. So, and he's tried to hobble together something. He's failed so far by most accounts. He's not put together the kind of money that he needs to bail out one bank, let alone if there's more than one bank in trouble. And then the question is this another example of the brinkmanship that I talked about before? They say we're not going to allow state aid. We're not going to allow this bailout. It's called state aid is the particular provision. And but at the end, they'll give in. So no one really knows. It's another example of the brinkmanship, and it's another example of how it is so difficult when you have such diversity to get a set of rules, particularly when you have a kind of a bureaucracy that is extraordinary rule-bound. And just to give you one more example of that kind of rule-bound bureaucracy, Spain is just recovering. I talked about the great news that it has only a 20% unemployment. And Portugal is just recovering. The European Commission said, but look at your deficit. It's still over 3% of GDP. You have to have another big dose of austerity because you violated our rules. Your reaction was my reaction. Thank you. And this went on back and forth, and eventually the European Commission pulled back. And they said, next year you have to do it. So it's another example of a rigid bureaucracy alienating all the citizens at the last minute, recognizing it can't do what it says, but maybe more broadly, it's a bureaucracy and a set of institutions that are not out of sync with the democracies, and that is perhaps one of the most disturbing things, because it is undermining confidence in European democracy, and because the center-left and the center-right parties are both so supportive of the euro, is giving rise support to the more extremist parties, and of particular concern are the growth of the extremist parties on the right.